I made the assumption when that happened that it was a response from the Anglican hierarchy to my comments about authority. Right. I gather it was the builders at the other end of the building digging through some cable or something. So
who's told them to do it?
Not that we believe in conspiracy theories or anything, but Mark, there was just one other thing you wanted to add, and then we'll kind of open up a little bit more.
Yeah, just on the authority issue, there's absolutely no doubt that the interest that we will get from hierarchy or those in senior leadership is because they would like to continue their control. Now, we have to be smart about that, make good use of that, and transform that. That's it.
Thanks. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I was talking to a colleague of mine who is head of communications for the Baptist Union a little while ago. And the Baptist Union have a governance structure where they have an annual conference where they send delegates, they make decisions there, and they pass those decisions to the communications unit. The communications unit communicates it out to the rest of the Baptist Union. And she said to me, at our last conference gathering, we discovered that during the conference itself, people were blogging from the conference floor. They were saying, oh, you never guess what so-and-so has just said, or we're discussing this now, how should I vote? And she said to me, how are we supposed to control that? To which my answer was, you're not. But it does raise all sorts of questions, doesn't it, for those of us who do care about the church. I want to kind of open this up a little bit now so that we can, between us, identify issues to discuss. But there's a question of definition that I'm going to refer to Mark Howell for wisdom on. And I mean, just speak from where you are, if people are able to hear. I hope we can deal with that. The question was, we talked about Christianity in the digital space. And it might be worth talking about what we mean by the digital space, because there would be different ways of understanding that. Mark, you've got some thoughts about that.
Well, very briefly, we were talking about this a bit earlier. We talk about the internet. It seems to me that what we think the internet we talk a lot about the internet. It seems to me that quite a lot depends on what kind of thingy we think the internet is. So for this conference, for example, we talked about the internet as a space. If we say the internet is a space, then there are kind of assumptions that go with that kind of language. A space is somewhere that you go to. A space is somewhere that probably has borders. A space is somewhere that you can maybe restrict access. There are things that happen when you say the internet's a space. There'll be other people who would say that the internet, for example, is a channel or a media. Like Radio 4, you don't go to Radio 4. Well, I do know some people who seem to live in Radio 4, but I'm not sure that's healthy. But most people don't go to Radio 4. You react to a medium rather differently to the way you react to a physical space. One other idea would be culture. I mean, is internet actually less about the technology than about the way of being? One of our St Pixels meetings last year, we had some outside speakers, and they sat there and watched what happened as 50 people milled around in the conference centre. And after a while they said, you do realise that you people actually behave like you're in the chat room physically. And they're absolutely right. We'd be sitting there, someone would walk in the door, make a speech, and then walk out again. And they said, yeah, this is not normal. This is not what people normally do in church. So is, and to what extent are we actually talking about changing culture that just happens to happen on the internet or by computers and so on, but in fact can happen in society in general? Or is the internet something else again? So I think the plan was maybe maybe I'll talk around our tables or whatever and kick some of those ideas around, and then if we could very briefly get some ideas back from the floor as to how you feel about those kind of areas.
Well, there's a question posed then. What do we mean by the digital space that we are talking about? So if you'd like to have a little conversation about that. And the other thing I would like to collect in a few minutes when you've had some time to think is other items that you would like to put on the agenda for discussion, issues that we need to deal with. There are many of them. Some of them are about Christian community online, some of them are about ethics or spirituality or all sorts of other things. So let's just take some time to talk around those questions of definition. What do we mean by the digital space and engaging with the digital space? And then we'll play some thoughts.
So, yeah, we were chatting about the concept of this idea called the digital space. And I was suggesting that for me, the idea of a digital space is larger than the internet, but does include the internet. So, for example, one of the guys here, his son downloads whole computer games for his Xbox. I'm on the internet through apps on my phone, connecting to other people, but not necessarily through the browser. So if there's a tradition that the internet might be, as in going through the browser, actually the digital space is a lot wider. On top of the upcoming large stuff about internet coming through your cables rather than your antenna, that's all digital medium, but not necessarily in people's minds connected to the internet. But I would see it part of the larger digital space. I don't know if that answers the internet is, but I see it as kind of not the whole sum of the digital space, but part of it.
Right, more than the internet, a good starting point. Any other comments on the back of that? I mean, I would tend to agree with that, that it's not about one particular application, but others might have more to say. We almost called this conference Christianity in the Digital Environment, which kind of implies more of what Mark was describing as digital culture. That the world that we're in is dominated by digital technology, whether we like it or not. I suppose that's the difference it makes. You could never go on the internet at all, if you were my mum, but still have to live the rest of your life in a digital environment. Does that make sense? Any other thoughts on that?
Does our desire to define it in itself reflect a way of thinking that we ought to ditch?
Yes. Does the desire to pin down the definition come out of a way of thinking that we don't need any more anyway? Maybe. I just think for the usefulness of our next couple of days of conversation, we need to say, we're talking about this, not that. And for me, it's about much more than just the internet. It's about the culture that is created by the technologies through which we are engaging. Is that fair? Okay, in terms of setting the agenda for things that we need to talk through, who would like to start on that? Anybody like to open the office? Stuff that we need to be talking through. Steve?
One of the jurisdiction questions and the authority thing raised is not just about authority, it's also to do with to what extent are we representative and connected to, and how to the church as the bigger entity, as opposed to individual churches that may exist or Christian communities.
Right, so in terms of authority, there's, if we do want to talk about real life church, there are questions about the church as well as questions about the local church, but for some those questions themselves might not be particularly relevant. But certainly there are questions about authority in relation to the church, whether it's got a capital C or a small c. For me, there are wider questions about authority in terms of the kind of thing about if you live in a Wikipedia age, how do you know what to believe or who to believe about anything? The kind of flattening effect of digital technology that means that we're now all on a level playing field in terms of communication. I mean, for people like me whose background is in the television industry, what it means is that Channel X, for which you can get 10 minutes of free sample at 11 o'clock on a weekday evening, is on exactly the same playing field really as BBC One in terms of authority. They all take the same number of clicks to get there. So there are broader authority questions that really have nothing to do with the church, but they're about who on earth do you believe in this environment? Who do you trust? David?